Since the beginning of Russia's 2022 invasion, there are a few prospects that have caused more international speculation or anxiety than the question of whether or not Russia would eventually resort to the use of nuclear weapons. Repeatedly, over the course of more than 2.5 years of full-scale war, Russian media and political figures have drawn red lines for potential nuclear use, only to walk them back or hurriedly forget them when those lines were almost inevitably crossed. But in almost all of these cases, those seeking to judge the validity of those Russian threats could always point to Russia's own nuclear doctrine, to suggest that even when the rhetorical temperature started to get a little bit high, circumstances were still well short of meeting Russia's published threshold for nuclear use. Last month, however, Russia appears to have signalled how its nuclear doctrine might now be changing, with Putin setting out new principles that seem to at least somewhat widen the scenarios where Russia would consider going nuclear. The intimidation factor of the announcement may have been somewhat mitigated by the fact that around the same time, Russia appears to have succeeded in blowing up one of its own test sites during a failed test of the Sarmat ICBM. But with thousands of delivery systems and warheads in Russian inventory, there's probably more than enough functional firepower there to make any revision to Russia's nuclear doctrine a point of international concern. So today, I'm going to dive into what Putin has said about the new rules for Russian nuclear use, whether it actually matters and increases or decreases the prospect of nuclear use, and how other countries may choose to respond if Russia once again starts to rattle the nuclear sabre. To do that, I'll give a brief refresher on nuclear doctrine and why it matters, and then zoom in on Russia's policy up to this recent change. Then we'll discuss the changes as we understand them so far, why Russia might be choosing to make them, and then question what this might actually mean for the risk of nuclear weapons actually being used as a result of the Ukraine war. In doing that, I'll highlight not just the things that have changed, but also the things that haven't, including some of the very strong incentives countries have to maintain the nuclear taboo and resist attempts at nuclear coercion. Obvious caveat here that I'm not a nuclear strategist, so I'll be relying pretty heavily on materials that the relevant nations have published, basic game theory, historical precedent, and the work of some relevant analysts. But before we get into what will no doubt be a very light-hearted discussion of potentially world-devastating superweapons, a quick word from a sponsor. In the context of a modern information environment that often absolutely saturates you with stories and information, sometimes you might want to have a tool to potentially help you get a fuller picture and more balanced perspective. To that end, Ground uses a website and app that gathers related articles from more than 50,000 sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same stories. For example, if you look at coverage of the news Russia may be increasing its defence spending by about 25% in 2025, you can click through and see what different sources are choosing to elevate to their headline. This Russian state media article, for example, only gives the rough dollar value of the draft national defence budget, $148.5 billion, but its other headlines that might flag the scale of an increase that this represents, or mention the war in Ukraine as a critical driver. And as you click through, you'll also be able to see other potentially relevant context, like information on media ownership, as well as assessments of media factuality and political lean by 3 independent news monitoring organisations. There are also other interesting features that might be worth unpacking. I constantly flag the blind spot feed. What this can do is try to surface stories that are being disproportionately covered by sources from one point or another on the political spectrum. And an obvious use case there is it might give you more visibility over stories that are unlikely to be covered by sources you might ordinarily consume. I've said in the past that I don't think there's any single solution to problems like echo chambers or distorted reporting. But there's still problems worth confronting, and Ground News might help. So if you are interested, you can go to ground.news/Perun or use the link in the description. That'll get you access to a 40% discount on a Vantage plan, which gets you unlimited access to all of Ground News features. And so with my thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. So quick refresher to start with. What is a nuclear doctrine? Why might you have one? And what might you achieve by changing it? There's no internationally agreed rule on what has to go into a public-facing nuclear doctrine or strategy. But many, although far from all nuclear weapon states, do invest the resources in publishing documents that tend to answer at least a couple of questions. What role do they see nuclear weapons playing in their security? Under what circumstances might those weapons be used? How would they be used? And critically, how would they not be used? And historically, we've seen some massive variation when it comes to that final point, with strategic nuclear warfare basically being a first response under US massive retaliation doctrine of the early Cold War era, for example, where it would only be a slight exaggeration to say that a Soviet conscript throwing a paper airplane at an American checkpoint in Germany might have been enough to trigger the nuclear annihilation of Eastern Europe, all the way through to concepts where the red button is something you only push when your national survival has one foot in the grave. Publishing a nuclear doctrine or making statements about your intended use is often part of what's often called declaratory strategy, where you're trying to achieve something by telling the rest of the world how you would or wouldn't use nuclear weapons. That might have a range of goals, like deterring your opponents from taking particular actions, or reducing the risk of miscalculation in a crisis. If you publicly adopt a very conservative approach to nuclear release, for example, everyone involved might be a little less jumpy and less likely to make a catastrophic, potentially world-ending miscalculation. On the right there, I have an extract of US declaratory policy regarding nuclear weapons from the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review. It sets out that, quote, as long as nuclear weapons exist, the fundamental role of US nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack on the United States, our allies, and partners. The US would only consider the use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the United States or its allies and partners. That language is important, for example, because it explicitly asserts that the United States provides a nuclear umbrella to its allies and partners. But at the same time, it also includes at least one very significant limitation. The United States says it will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state that is a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and in compliance with those obligations. In terms of policy objectives, that might provide an incentive for countries not to go nuclear because that protects you against being nuked by the United States. And that's really an ironclad security guarantee when you think about it, as long as you have the capacity to defeat the United States military in a conventional war without using WMDs of your own. Another somewhat extreme example of declaratory strategy are so-called no first use policies, countries that say they will only use nuclear weapons in response to another country using them or some other weapon of mass destruction first. For the vast majority of their time as nuclear weapon states, this has very clearly included both the People's Republic of China and India. Although in both cases, arguably the boundaries and future of those respective policies is perhaps not as certain as it once was. The obvious caveat, of course, and one we'll come back to later because it's significant in the context of this episode, is that nuclear doctrines don't have any sort of magical binding power. If Keir Starmer decides he wants to throw out a couple of high-altitude nuclear detonations in order to spice up the next New Year's fireworks show, nothing is going to physically stop the missiles leaving their tubes, even though that is not a case of doctrinally compliant nuclear usage. Ultimately, these doctrines, strategies, and policies are just pieces of paper, very important and strategically significant pieces of paper, but only as binding as text on a page ever is. Okay, so let's pivot from nuclear doctrine in general to Russian nuclear doctrine specifically. And here, one of the key points we're always going to be looking for is the question of nuclear threshold. Basically, how bad do things have to be before Russia will consider using a nuclear weapon, at least according to its doctrine? Moscow's nuclear doctrine has obviously undergone a lot of changes from the Soviet era through to 2024. The Soviet Union, for example, had access to an enormous amount of conventional combat power and a network of allies, something that Russia in the 1990s very much didn't. So especially during the Yeltsin era, you do see an increased focus on nuclear weapons in Russian security strategy. Indeed, the Russian Minister of Defense from May 1997 through March 2001 was Marshal Sergeyev. He came from the Strategic Rocket Forces as his background, and so, as you can imagine, he showed more than a little bit of favouritism to the nuclear forces during his time as the Minister of Defense, with the apparent logic being that Russia was hopelessly, hilariously, conventionally outmatched by its NATO competitors, and so nuclear weapons were really the only practical way to guarantee Russia's security. During parts of the Putin era, however, we actually started to see the nuclear threshold raised and conventional forces become relatively more important. As the Russian budget and the Russian military more broadly began to recover, concepts of conventional deterrence became increasingly important once more, and Russian defence policy became less and less like a bloke brandishing a grenade at everyone around them, saying that he'll pull the pin if they come too close. Prior to the 2022 invasion, the most recent comprehensive statement we'd been given on where Russian nuclear doctrine stood was from 2020. In 2020, we got the basic principles of state policy of the Russian Federation on nuclear deterrence. And while it included some statements that might at a surface level seem worrying to some observers based on what the objective of nuclear use might be, for example, the document said it provided not just for the prevention of escalation of military actions, but also, quote, their termination on conditions that are acceptable for the Russian Federation and or its allies, which is language you might think is indicative of potentially quite proactive use or threatened use of nuclear weapons. But at the same time, it also included language that pulled back on that sort of interpretation, saying things like, quote, the Russian Federation considers nuclear weapons exclusively as a means of deterrence, their use being an extreme and compelled measure, end quote. But what we're probably most interested in out of the 2020 document is not those general statements, but rather those explicit conditions it outlined where Russia might consider employing nuclear weapons. The 2020 document set out 4 scenarios where Russia might consider hitting the button.
The first was the Russian government receiving reliable data that some other power may have fired ballistic missiles against the territory of the Russian Federation and or its allies. This was basically the Russians saying that if they saw something that looked awfully like a nuclear attack, like the mass deployment of ICBMs against the Russian homeland, they might assume the worst and launch their own systems, rather than risk their own missiles being caught in their silos. Scenario 2 was pretty simple: the use of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction by an adversary against the Russian Federation and or its allies, aka nuke us and we will probably nuke you back, while scenarios 3 and 4 were potentially a bit more conventionally focused. The third scenario was where Russia was suffering attacks to critical sites that might undermine its ability to respond with nuclear force at some point in the future. And here again you can understand the potential logic. If you're relying on nuclear weapons to provide a degree of deterrence against opposing weapons of mass destruction, and they start destroying your ability to use your nuclear weapons, even if that's only being done with conventional weapons, it still poses the risk of Russia potentially being caught on the wrong side of a one-sided nuclear exchange in the future. So, once again, perhaps inspired by the patterns and precedents of Slavic history as a whole, Moscow might presume the worst and let the missiles fly. Finally, Russia indicated that it might use nuclear weapons in a situation where the Russian Federation was being attacked, including with only conventional weapons, but to a point that was so existential that the very existence of the Russian state was in jeopardy. I think it's a reasonable thing to say that that represents a very high threshold for nuclear employment. You could half-jokingly argue that you'd have to get to the point where Leopards and Abrams were rolling down Red Square before you'd trigger that potential use case, but given the history suggests that it's entirely possible to reach Moscow as an invader and still lose, on paper at least, a lawyer might have argued that even that may not have been enough. In short, by international standards, at least on paper, this wasn't a particularly trigger-happy approach to nuclear weapons use. That said, there were some pretty serious arguments, especially in the West, about the exact features of Russia's approach to nuclear weapons, and in particular, whether or not it supported a concept that, beyond all those other use cases, Russia might also consider using a nuclear weapon in order to bring a conflict to a victorious close. The American 2018 Nuclear Posture Review included a reference to exactly this kind of potential usage, saying the following: Moscow threatens and exercises limited nuclear first use, suggesting a mistaken expectation that coercive nuclear threats, or limited first use, could paralyse the USA and NATO and thereby end a conflict on terms favourable to Russia. Some in the United States refer to this as Russia's escalate to de-escalate doctrine. The claim there is basically that if Russia ever found itself in an unfavourable position, it could choose to set a nuke off just to cause everyone to go, whoa, hold on a moment, this is pretty bad. And then because they were so concerned by this sudden second sunrise, making concessions to Russia in order to lower the temperature and end a conflict on terms favourable to Russia. That sounds potentially quite concerning because it would represent, arguably, a lower threshold of nuclear use, going beyond the 4 use cases we just identified. For whatever it's worth, however, the Russians denied that they would ever do something like that, with Lavrov specifically saying, quote, "We would not have any escalation in order to de-escalate as Western powers try to present it. And while Lavrov's record is such that if he told me the sky was blue, I'd probably glance upwards just to check it hadn't suddenly changed colour, when it comes to nuclear coercion, it does kind of undercut the effectiveness, arguably, if you deny you're making any such threat. As such, I don't think we can confidently conclude that escalate to de-escalate was actually a core component of Russian nuclear thinking, and that those 4 use cases were really at the core of those 2020 principles, with President Vladimir Putin, of course, being the key decision-maker on any potential ambiguities. For example, whether or not a Ukrainian bushmaster doing burnouts out the front of a police station in Suja represented an existential threat to the very existence of the Russian state. If, however, you assume that Moscow was going to interpret those principles in a pretty reasonable way and follow its own nuclear doctrine, not necessarily ironclad assumptions, but bear with me for a moment, you may not have been that worried about the prospect of potential Russian nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine. Ukraine didn't have a known inventory of weapons of mass destruction or a vast fleet of long-range ballistic missiles, so 2 use cases could be struck off right from the start. Ukraine also didn't have any realistic capacity to paralyse Russia's ability to launch nuclear weapons, ruling out another option. And even if Ukraine took back every single inch of its internationally recognised territory, it's hard to argue that would represent an existential threat to the very existence of the Russian state, given that in the past, the Russian state has proven perfectly capable of functioning without them. To oversimplify, unless one or more of Ukraine's allies became directly militarily involved in the conflict, or we started to see the likes of Minuteman III ballistic missiles appear in the announced arms packages, it's hard to see how any of those 4 scenarios for Russian nuclear use would actually come into play. And arguably, from a Russian perspective, that may have presented a problem.
Because if you're trying to leverage nuclear coercion or potential anxiety around nuclear escalation, setting out a doctrine that says you won't use nuclear weapons outside of situations that are extremely unlikely to occur in the scenario in question may actually be counterproductive and reduce how seriously other countries take your implied or explicit threats. It might also mean you have to jump through more hoops in order to create a plausible scenario where others might feel apprehension about potential nuclear weapons use, and that may actually have been something we saw to some extent in October 2022. And I want to zoom in on that period for a moment because I'd argue it gives a decent illustration of the way that doctrine, nuclear coercion, and the context of the war in Ukraine can all collide. Okay, so let's jump in a mental time machine for a moment and ride it all the way back to 2022. In the first few months of the invasion, Moscow's nuclear signalling mostly seems to have been directed against deterring direct NATO involvement in Ukraine. We saw Russian figures making some vague references to doctrine and the dangers of interference, but the clearer statements around potential red lines mostly seem to have focused on the idea of NATO troops potentially rolling into Ukraine or imposing a no-fly zone. But once it became increasingly clear both that NATO aircraft were unlikely to appear in the skies over Ukraine anytime soon, and conditions on the ground appeared to shift against the Russian military, it suggested that Russian nuclear signalling started to shift around that September of 2022. And here I want to note I'm drawing pretty heavily from a piece by Lachlan Mackenzie called 6 Days in October that chronologically sets out a lot of the Russian nuclear rhetoric in the September and October of 2022. It's in this period we arguably start to see Russian figures make more and varied nuclear threats of various kinds. For example, suggesting that Russia might use nuclear weapons to defend the territory in Ukraine that it claimed to have annexed, or similarly, that escalation might follow if Ukraine were to receive the sorts of weapons it was requesting from its various supporters in order to capitalise on this moment of opportunity. According to an official English language translation by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on the 15th of September 2022, one of their spokespeople said the following: "We would like to stress that the United States and its allies that supply weapons to the Kyiv regime are actually becoming accomplices in its war crimes. If Washington decides on supplying longer-range missiles, it will cross the red line and become a party to the conflict." That statement was fairly direct and unambiguous, and why when the United States eventually supplied ATACMS missiles much later, in 2023, World War III broke out and Russian missiles began flying towards the continental United States. For any Americans listening, I hope life in the nuclear wasteland is treating you well. Many of these warnings were expressed in quite serious terms, although perhaps always at least slightly undermined by the fact they seem to clash with Russia's stated principles on nuclear use. None of which would suggest that Russia would use nuclear weapons in defence of the kind of red lines that it was attempting to draw at the time. There was no prospect of the Russian nuclear deterrent being destroyed or disabled, a massed ballistic missile attack against the Russian homeland, nor did it seem at all credible that Russia would be facing an existential threat to the very existence of the Russian state, nor any weapons of mass destruction being used against it, until, suddenly in October, it seemed to be claiming there was. On the 23rd of October 2022, at a time when Russian troops were withdrawing in the face of an ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russian state media began airing claims that Ukraine was in the process of preparing a dirty bomb for use. The term dirty bomb relates to a kind of radiological weapon where you take a conventional explosive, wrap it in highly radioactive waste, giving you a device that isn't capable of generating a nuclear explosion, but which is capable of contaminating an area. It's also the kind of weapon that could potentially meet that Russian doctrinal threshold for an opponent using weapons of mass destruction, justifying a Russian nuclear response. Now, why exactly Ukraine was meant to want to use one of these bombs wasn't always completely clear. I found a case of one Russian government figure being quoted on record suggesting that Ukraine intended to use the device in order to frame Russia essentially and draw in a Western military response. But to me that seems at least a little bit counterintuitive, considering that if Russia were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it would very likely be, an actual nuclear weapon rather than a dirty bomb. And while, yes, both would generate some radiological contamination, it seems very unlikely the international community wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two, given the absence of, the whole nuclear explosion bit. But whatever the reasoning, a Ukrainian dirty bomb was the central Russian allegation. Russia's defense minister at the time, Sergei Shoigu, reportedly called his American, UK, French and Turkish counterparts to discuss the alleged threats, prompting the US, UK and France, as three permanent members of the UN Security Council, to issue a joint statement, saying, quote, "Our countries made clear that we reject Russia's transparently false allegations that Ukraine is preparing to use a dirty bomb on its own territory. The world would see through any attempt to use this allegation as a pretext for escalation," end quote. That indicates some public apprehension, at least, that Russia might have been generating this story in order to justify a potential escalation, even a nuclear escalation, within the framework of its own stated policy. The next day, October 24th, Russian Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, reportedly called his UK and US counterparts, reportedly to discuss this alleged dirty bomb threat, while Russia's head of the lower house of the Duma reportedly went on Telegram, describing Ukraine's supporters as sponsors of nuclear terrorism. Dmitry Peskov and Sergei Lavrov both insisted that the threat was very real, while Western officials continued to refute the claims, and NATO's Secretary General at the time cautioned that the Russian claims might signal preparation for a potential false flag attack. On October 25th, Russia essentially doubled down again, restating their claims about a potential Ukrainian dirty bomb to the United Nations Security Council. Ambassador Antonov said that the task of creating a dirty bomb had been given to two Ukrainian organisations without nominating which ones, and claimed that work on producing the device was at its concluding stage. Meanwhile, US President Biden, in response to a reporter's question, reportedly said that it would be an incredibly serious mistake for Russia to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Then on October 26, Putin himself echoed the dirty bomb claims during a meeting of security and intelligence heads of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Earlier that day, he'd reportedly overseen an annual Russian nuclear military drill, while Shoigu reportedly called the Indian and Chinese defense ministers to discuss the alleged threat. However, by this point, it appears that, at least publicly, Russia was starting to get a bit of international pushback to its claims and any potential escalation based on them. India's defense minister reportedly warned Shoigu that neither side in Ukraine should resort to using nuclear or radiological weapons, since their use would violate, as he put it, the basic tenets of humanity. NATO's Secretary General, meanwhile, underscored that there would be, quote, severe consequences for Russian nuclear use. We'll come back to potential motivation and reasoning in a moment, but if this was a trial balloon by the Russians in order to potentially justify or test the waters for a potential nuclear escalation, by this point the potential consequences of doing something like that may have been starting to crystallise. It's hard to imagine what sort of military utility Russia could ever hope to have obtained through limited nuclear use in Ukraine that would compensate for the economic and political cost of alienating countries like India, and the possibility of NATO countries potentially directly imposing consequences as a result of Russia taking that step may have shifted the risk calculus even further. By the 27th of October, I'd argue that any momentum towards potential escalation was at least publicly ebbing. The US Secretary of Defense had given a press conference saying they were very concerned about the prospect of escalation in Ukraine and warned that any Russian nuclear use there would be met with a, quote, very significant response. On the same day, Putin, while still talking about the prospect of Ukraine using a dirty bomb, was very much walking back from the prospect of Russia using any nuclear weapons of its own, reportedly saying, quote, there is no sense in it, meaning the use of a nuclear weapon for us, neither political nor military. The final Russian claim about Ukraine potentially using a dirty bomb came on October 28th from Russia's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Certainly a bit of a hierarchical downgrade from having Putin himself issue the warnings. And from there, at least for a while, the claims about Ukraine potentially using a dirty bomb appear to have pretty much ended. There would be some exceptions to the general trend towards cooling tensions. Having backed away from the prospect of one aspect of Russia's nuclear use principles being triggered, Medvedev would make a post on Telegram suggesting that another one might be. To paraphrase, he said that Ukraine's stated goal of taking back territories now claimed by Russia would constitute a threat to the existence of the Russian state, and would therefore directly trigger the fundamentals of the state policy on nuclear deterrence. He also rhetorically asked, what is this, if not a direct provocation of a world war with the use of nuclear weapons? Basically, instead of claiming that Ukraine was about to trigger the weapon of mass destruction use provision, he instead moved the focus to a very stretched definition of the existential threat provision. Ukraine appears to have called the bluff, however, and just over a week after Medvedev made that post, Russian forces completed their withdrawal from Kherson, a city they claimed to have annexed and declared forever Russian. During that period, from November 2022 through to the present day, there have been other examples of Russia stoking fears of nuclear escalation. But as an example, the September and October of 2022 probably provide a good enough one for us today. The question then is, what was the Russian goal, what was the result, and how might it have impacted on their decision to change doctrine more than a year and a half later? In terms of why Russia started suddenly yelling about the prospect of Ukraine using a dirty bomb, officially Western sources aren't sure.
Biden publicly said on the 25th of October, quote, "I'm not guaranteeing you that it's a false flag operation yet. I don't know," end quote. And Lachlan McKenzie, writing for the CSIS, advances at least 5 potential explanations. These included the following. 1. Russia may have been preparing to set a pretext for actual nuclear use. September and October 2022 were not exactly fantastic times for Russian forces in Ukraine, and so the dirty bomb story may have just been an attempt to generate a pretext to justify Russia deploying its tactical nuclear weapons. Think of it kind of like a situation where a bloke's getting his ass handed to him in a fistfight and so yells to the crowd that the other guy has a knife in order to justify pulling a handgun and dumping the magazine point blank. Option 2 is that this was just meant to be straight coercion, more nuclear blackmail to shape Western and Ukrainian decision-making without any intention to actually use nuclear weapons. Alternatively, despite the prospect of nuclear retaliation, Russia may have genuinely believed Ukraine was about to use a dirty bomb, or the entire affair, in whole or part, may have been primarily directed towards a Russian domestic audience, attempting to drum up fear of Ukraine, support for the military operation, and potentially to distract from all of the things that were happening on the front line around that time. I'm going to conclude this segment, though, by bringing back in the role of doctrine. The fact that the fact that a pretext was required to potentially use a Russian nuclear weapon may have provided a degree of stability, even though it still allowed Russia to exercise a degree of coercion. The basic thesis would be that whatever of those options you adopt, whether this was a genuine preparation for the Russian use of a nuclear weapon, or whether Russia genuinely believed for some bloody reason that Ukraine was going to use a dirty bomb, doctrine still provided a useful break. In the first case, because it demanded Russia actually create a pretext in the first instance, rather than just roll out the missiles and start blasting. And that in the second case, because doctrine required Russia to actually be attacked first, or for the attack to at the very least be launched, before nuclear weapons could be deployed in turn. They couldn't, according to their doctrine as written, be massively preemptive. I will suggest, though, that even though those Russian principles suggest that Russia wouldn't have used a nuclear weapon under these circumstances, that doesn't seem to have stopped Western powers from failing to provide the kind of decisive assistance necessary at perhaps the moment in the entire war when Ukraine was at the greatest advantage and was in the best position to capitalise on any sort of surge in assistance. In that respect, doctrine may have held back Russian coercion efforts, but it didn't stop them achieving at least something. So if the old Russian nuclear doctrine wasn't, for lack of a better term, scary enough, what have we been told about the new one? Keep in mind that at least at time of recording, we don't have the full text of the new doctrine, just Putin telling us what's in it. So for the moment, his statements are what we're going to rely on, which I think is reasonable enough, given that in Russia, he's at the very top of the nuclear decision-making hierarchy. In terms of themes, Putin reinforced the idea of Russia's nuclear umbrella, so to speak, and the idea that Russian nuclear weapons can be used in response not just to aggression against the Russian Federation itself, but also against the Federation's allies. The key example here is probably Belarus, which is even more topical now than it was in 2020, because now Belarus is known to play host to Russian nuclear weapons. That said, the 2020 Russian principles also had elements of this concept. They referred, for example, to Russia using nuclear weapons in response to, quote, the use of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction by an adversary against the Russian Federation and or its allies. To that extent, Putin's language here may not represent as much of a change as it might first appear. Then we get to a series of statements which arguably represent Russia lowering that threshold for potential nuclear employment, or at the very least tweaking it to potentially be more scary in the context of the Ukrainian conflict. For example, it was suggested that so-called aggression against the Russian Federation by a non-nuclear state, but one with the participation or support, as they put it, of a nuclear state, could be considered a joint attack by the two of them. You probably don't have to be Sherlock bloody Holmes in order to get what this one might be about. Ukraine is a non-nuclear weapon state that's receiving support from several nuclear weapon states, and this indicates Russia is at least suggesting that it might choose to interpret that kind of situation as one where Russia is being aggressed against by a nuclear-armed coalition. Whether or not that actually means anything in a practical sense is a question we'll come back to a little later on. But if we're highlighting changes from 2020, it's a principle that I think is absolutely worth flagging. We were also told that Russia may be prepared to use nuclear weapons upon the receipt of reliable information of a massive launch of air and space attack weapons and their crossing of the state border. That potentially included strategic and tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, hypersonics, etc. Now, on one hand, that might sound fairly concerning because massive drone attacks against Russia are basically a timetabled event these days. But I've also heard it argued that this is basically just an update of a previous principle to reflect new technological realities. Russia had previously said it might respond to warning that there was a massive incoming missile attack with nuclear force, presumably on the presumption those missiles might be carrying nuclear warheads. But you could also potentially argue those same principles of uncertainty might apply to aircraft, hypersonic missiles, or even potentially large strategic drones. Arguably the dangerous part here is that while most countries don't use large numbers of longer-range ballistic missiles as conventional offensive weapons, Iran is an obvious exception there, drones, aircraft, and hypersonics are routinely used to deliver conventional warheads. And so if Russia is caressing the nuclear trigger every time it sees Ukrainian drones or cruise missiles cross the Russian border, the risk of a serious miscalculation may be considerably higher than a world where only ballistic missiles triggered that sort of alarm. But perhaps the change that's gathered the most attention comes down to a subtle but potentially very significant shift in wording. Under the 2020 principles, Russia indicated it might be willing to use a nuclear weapon if a conventional attack threatened the ongoing existence of the Russian state. Now in 2024, the new construction appears to be that nuclear weapons might be used in response to a conventional attack that posed a, quote, critical threat to sovereignty, end quote. Compared to drawing a red line at the end of the Russian state, a critical threat to sovereignty is much more vague a concept, and that may well be the point. Occupying a small sliver of Russian territory hundreds of kilometres from Moscow, for example, obviously doesn't pose an existential threat to the existence of the Russian state. But when you're talking about a critical threat to sovereignty, you've got an adjective playing with abstract nouns. And so where the red line might be drawn under that new wording really comes down to a matter of interpretation. At the most extreme interpretation, foreign capitals will now have to hold their breath every time Pavel and his mates march into so much as a Russian fast food restaurant, as they wait to determine whether Putin considers the loss of a rebadged McDonald's to be a critical and unacceptable threat to Russian sovereignty. Which brings us to the question of what may have catalysed these changes and why Russia has chosen now to apparently introduce more ambiguity to their publicly stated principles around nuclear weapon use. One theory up front might be that this is linked to refining Russia's efforts, if you will, to use the fear of nuclear weapons to influence Western behaviour. We already looked at one specific example from 2022, but if you were to evaluate the overall successfulness of Russian nuclear coercion in Ukraine as a whole, I'd suggest you could argue that even when it hasn't been 100% effective, it has probably had a valuable impact. Ukraine's various allies have often chosen to eventually cross potential Russian red lines, regarding everything from the supply of military equipment to authorizations regarding how that military equipment is used. But those decisions have often been considerably more conservative, drawn out, and less impactful than they could have been. Everything from HIMARS to main battle tanks to ATACMS to fighter jets. All of these systems have been subject to intense debates lasting from months to years and have often come with significant restrictions on their use. The stated public cause for that apparent caution has often been a fear of escalation. And given it stretches credibility a bit to suggest that the combined armed forces of NATO, including the United States, would feel conventionally intimidated or overmatched by the Russian armed forces, which are still struggling to overcome just the Ukrainian military, I think the evidence suggests that apprehension over Russia's nuclear capabilities probably plays at least some role in that determination by Ukraine's allies to avoid escalation, even at very significant cost. Obviously, Russian nuclear saber-rattling hasn't been enough to stop aid eventually arriving, but it's probably helped put the brakes on it and help shape the relevant balance that we see in Ukraine now. And if we're looking for evidence that the war in Ukraine is central to the change the Russians are making here, you don't have to look particularly far. Russian government figures, including the deputy foreign minister, have publicly stated that Russia will be changing its nuclear doctrine because of the Western role in Ukraine. That suggests to me that Russia considers it strategically very important to cut down the amount of support that Ukraine is receiving from its various allies, and that they regard their nuclear use policy as one mechanism they can use to achieve that. If the reason a policy is being changed is because you want to pressure an opponent into changing their behaviour, it's kind of hard to argue this isn't at least a bit about nuclear coercion. If we were to push a little bit further into the realm of speculation, obviously acknowledging that that's what we're choosing to do, one example of a significant issue this might be trying to influence is the debate around Ukraine, long-range systems, and targeting within Russia. It's become increasingly clear over time that part of Ukraine's concept for victory, so to speak, might be to get more and more long-range systems, which can then use to strike targets deep into Russian territory, both in order to damage the Russian military and to impose broader costs on the Russian state. There are a couple of reasons Ukraine might be very strongly motivated to gain the capability to launch these kind of attacks at scale. and why Russia has every incentive to apply almost any pressure possible to make sure that it doesn't find itself in a future where it has to face salvo after salvo of Western-built air-launched cruise missiles, center-punching critical targets from Rostov to the outskirts of Moscow. For Russia, Ukrainian access to better long-range weapons minimise its ability to control the risk and costs that come with the war. As long as Ukraine can, for the most part, only fight Russia in Ukraine or immediately adjacent to it, Russia can more or less select what resources it chooses to risk by sending them to Ukraine, and also what sort of resources are most likely to be expended. If Russian command, for example, ever became concerned about the rate at which it was losing tanks or aircraft in Ukraine, it could choose to pull back those resources further into Russian territory, and perhaps partially compensate by increasing its commitment of resources it might care a little bit less about, like drones or Russian infantry. If Ukraine can regularly and effectively strike deep into Russian territory, however, they get more of a say over what this war costs Moscow, whether that be an oil refinery here or an airbase there. Even just from a purely military perspective, I'd argue some of the recent strikes we've seen against Russian air bases and ammunition depots have proven the sort of value that kind of additional reach can have. Recently, we'd seen reporting that the United States was seriously considering supplying Ukraine with the AGM-158 JASSM, a stealthy air-launched cruise missile that would have significantly boosted, one imagines, Ukraine's ability to strike over longer distances. Several Russian figures, for their part, issued warnings against the supply of that kind of system. And now, coincidentally around the same time that Russia begins announcing changes to its nuclear doctrine, it appears that, at least for the moment, Washington may have blinked. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen a number of large military aid packages for Ukraine announced by the United States, in part because some previously voted Ukraine aid funding was due to expire, and the administration may have been faced with a bit of a use it or lose it situation. Those announcements did include a new, longer-ranged air-launched munition for Ukraine's F-16s, but not the AGM-158 that the Ukrainians probably wanted. Instead, Ukraine will apparently be getting the AGM-154 Joint Standoff Weapon. And critically, it's not an air-launched cruise missile, but a relatively fancy glide bomb. And that's what arguably makes some of the reporting we've seen around this system being supplied potentially a little bit deceptive. Some reports, for example, have described this as a long-range weapon with a range north of 110 kilometres or 60 miles. And while that might be technically correct, it only holds true if the pilot is able to release the thing from high altitude at high speed. For Ukrainian pilots, flying at high altitude is often going to be an excellent way to make sure you get more flight time on your ejection seat. And if they would like to keep their airplane by flying at very low altitude to avoid the bulk of Russian anti-aircraft threats, basic physics dictates that 110 plus kilometre range on the JSO will decrease slightly to north of 20 kilometres, taking the system from one that can outrange the Gimler's rockets fired by HIMARS and M270 down to one that can be outranged by some 155mm artillery. None of this is to say that the JSO isn't a good weapon, that it won't be useful for Ukraine, nor that it doesn't represent an upgrade over the JDAM-ER they've often been using to date. But it isn't the critical capability that Ukraine has been requesting, nor the one that Russia has been fearing. And one has to wonder about the role that escalation fears might have played in that decision. So now I want to start moving from what the change has been to what the implications might be. Does Russia revising its nuclear threshold in this way mean we should all be dialing up Voltec to reserve our places before the bombs start dropping? And here there are obviously multiple interpretations out there, with one being that this is a serious implied threat by Russia, and that the doomsday clock should probably tick closer to midnight as Russian nuclear use in Ukraine becomes more likely. The key thrust to this argument might be that the conditions set out in Russia's revised nuclear doctrine, at least as Putin has expressed it, are far more likely to be met or triggered in Ukraine than the previous version. Ukraine was never really in a position to pose an existential threat to the very existence of the Russian state, but threats to sovereignty are obviously far more subjective. But with regards to the question of whether or not Russia is actually moving towards the prospect of nuclear employment, based on the available evidence and most of the commentators I looked at, the initial answer to that question seems to be a pretty simple no. While we are seeing a change to Russia's nuclear doctrine, we're not seeing a bunch of the other steps we might expect to see if Russia was getting close to actual nuclear use. You'd probably expect to see a significant shift in the status and readiness of Russia's nuclear forces. You might expect to see a significant increase in the size and tempo of exercises intended to prepare the civilian and military population for the potential consequences of that use. And as one commentator noted, we haven't even really seen Putin dial up the direct or indirect threats yet, at least not above the baseline level that we've generally become accustomed to. He wouldn't even need to coin the threat directly. There are plenty of figures in the Russian media who make serious threats all the time,
And all it might take for Putin to raise the temperature at least a little bit would be to make at least a small positive reference towards one of them in their statements. The head of Russia's ski federation recently, for example, complaining about the fact that Russian athletes had been barred from so many competitions, reportedly suggested, quote, "It seems to me that if we had dropped a serious bomb in the centre of London, everything would be over by now. We would have been allowed to go anywhere," in reference to Russian athletes. Now, leaving aside for a moment the somewhat strange intersection of strategic bombing and sports policy, I've seen it suggested that if Putin wanted to rattle the nuclear sabre a little bit, he wouldn't even have to say, "Hey, we should totally nuke London, guys," but rather to say, "Hey, Yelena's doing a great job over at the Ski Federation. I think she's got some great ideas." At the moment, we're not seeing even that level of indirect signalling. To borrow the words of one commentator, which I'll link in the description, talk is easy and has a political impact, but evidence of actual willingness to use nuclear weapons is both absent and something we can detect if it ever happens. So far, Russia may have said it's changing the rules, but it isn't acting like it. There's also a secondary point here that I don't want to overemphasize, but I do want to flag. If you wanted to pick an ideal time to escalate nuclear tensions, it would probably be one where everyone involved was confident in the reliability of your nuclear forces. And while there are no doubt significant parts of the Russian strategic arsenal that are probably entirely functional, there are also a couple of small kinks they appear to be in the process of trying to work out. This is a satellite image reportedly of the aftermath of a Russian test of the Sarmat ICBM back in September, which appears not just to have added a fourth flight test failure to the Sarmat's record, but also destroyed the only silo present capable of actually fitting the thing. That may not matter overmuch in terms of the structure and capability of the Russian missile forces as they stand today, but given the problematic messaging and signal that something like this can send, there's a non-zero chance we'd see more exercises or tests involving systems that do work in order to ram home the reliability of the threat before a potential escalation scenario. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence, I think, for the argument that Russia has now drawn a new immutable nuclear line in the sand is that arguably, almost before Russia had even finished explaining the new line, Ukraine was already diving across it. Ukraine is fighting military actions against the Russian Federation with the support of nuclear powers like the United States, United Kingdom and France, but Russia is not choosing to treat those actions as joint attacks, nor behave like it's at war with the United States and UK for some strange reason. Ukraine has also launched a series of massive-scale drone attacks against the Russian Federation without a nuclear response, and continues to occupy a stretch of internationally recognised sovereign Russian territory without so much as a single big red button being pressed. In that respect, at least, you could argue that it seems that Russia attempted to set some very ambitious new boundaries for the way this conflict would play out, and Ukraine's response has basically been to say, well, go on then, and continue to do whatever it is they were doing before. That doesn't mean there isn't a Russian nuclear red line somewhere, but wherever it is, it does seem to be well beyond the scope of the war as it's currently being fought, or the most extreme possible interpretation of Putin's words. That said, I'd also be cautious about fully embracing the alternative interpretation that this whole thing is one big nothing burger and nothing has really changed. The very fact that a change was made and announced represents a signalling mechanism in and of itself. And the new thresholds, even if Ukraine has already arguably successfully tested some of them, are significantly lower than what was in place before. What that might mean is that when the West is trying to gauge the potential credibility of future Russian nuclear saber-rattling, it has more difficulty assessing the actual risk than it did previously. It'll no longer be possible to look at a potential statement by someone like Medvedev and point to Russia's actual stated nuclear doctrine and say that no, at least according to what they published and signalled, this man's threats are not credible. With the new doctrine in place, it may not be possible to be quite so confident. Although Medvedev himself is probably likely to remain about as credible as a random WhatsApp message saying they can get you 2% daily returns on your crypto investments. Where that seems to leave us for the moment, at least according to most commentators, is somewhere between the two extremes. This announcement isn't entirely without meaning, but it's also not an immediate threat either. To use an imperfect analogy, you could argue Russia isn't so much full-on brandishing the nuclear sabre for all to see, so much as just resting its hand on the hilt while the sword's still in the scabbard. And from their perspective, even just that might have some value. It could help apply pressure and shift public opinion, particularly amongst Ukraine's allies, by, for example, trying to reinforce the message to members of the public in the United States, Germany, or various European countries that the threat of a nuclear war with Russia is very real, and so the only practical option is to give Russia what it wants: Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian diplomatic isolation in exchange for an end to the nuclear fear. At least until Russia decides to leverage those fears all over again. And if we do see further debates amongst Ukraine's allies about what sort of quantities of aid to supply, what sort of systems to send, what sort of permissions to give, it may be that Russia hopes that the anxiety and uncertainty generated by this announcement may not just affect members of the public, but also the relevant decision makers as well. One imperfect litmus test I might suggest is that if in coming months we continue to see Western leaders cite escalation fears as a reason not to send systems like the Taurus cruise missile or the JASSM-ER to Ukraine, nor to give expanded permissions to Ukraine to strike targets inside Russian territory, then you could probably argue that at least to some extent, Russia's nuclear coercion is working. In which case, you can almost guarantee that we'll see more of it. But there's at least three factors, I think, that speak against the idea that Russia changing its nuclear doctrine is likely to result in the country getting everything it wants in Ukraine. With the first simply being that when it comes to assessing the scale of a nuclear threat, doctrine probably isn't the be-all and end-all. Russia has never been compelled to use a nuclear weapon just because doctrine says use in those circumstances may be acceptable, nor has there ever been anything physically stopping Russia from using a nuclear weapon in defiance of its own principles on nuclear use. We basically know that to be the case because if other countries had perfect confidence in Russia following its own stated principles on nuclear use, then they probably wouldn't have been overly concerned about the dangers of nuclear escalation over the last 2.5 years, nor the nuclear threats that Russia has made or implied. There is arguably nothing in those Russian 2020 nuclear principles that would have supported a nuclear weapon being used to defend Kherson or respond to long-range missiles being supplied to Ukraine by NATO, or rather NATO member states. So with the possible exception of things like the dirty bomb scare in the September and October of 2022, the vast majority of the anxiety amongst Ukraine's various allies over the danger of nuclear escalation must have had less to do with Russian nuclear doctrine and more to do with the fear that Russia would use a nuclear weapon despite its doctrine. That being the case, arguably the main concern for Ukrainian and allied decision makers isn't so much what does Russian doctrine say, as what do you expect Vladimir Putin to do. And while changing Russian doctrine may give us some clues as to how Putin's thinking on the subject has changed, in the end, the two don't have to be aligned. And you'd probably expect intelligence services to focus effort on trying to determine Putin's intent and the opinions of the wider Russian leadership, rather than throw it all away in favour of a close study of Russia's new nuclear principles whenever they're finally released. The second point is that even if Russian doctrine around use of nuclear weapons may have changed, the logic around whether or not they should be used probably hasn't. And while yes, it is always possible for leaders to make terribly illogical decisions, generally speaking, I'd suggest that it's more likely that Russia would use a nuclear weapon if it was in a position to actually get something by doing so. And I think the evidence suggests that now, just as in 2022, from the Russian perspective, the costs probably far outweigh the potential benefits. In terms of battlefield impact, a single non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapon probably isn't going to make that much of a difference. You might be able to thoroughly destroy a selected target, like an airbase or a storage facility, and there would almost certainly be some shock value. But because of the threat of conventional weapons, military forces in Ukraine already tend to be highly dispersed and very dug in. That probably makes them fairly inefficient targets for tactical nuclear weapons and goes some way towards explaining why Cold War, NATO and Soviet planning often tend to call for the use of lots and lots of tactical nuclear weapons, even along relatively narrow areas of front. Nuclear weapons are at their most horrific and most obviously dangerous when they're used in a counter-value mode, as a strategic weapon against things like cities. Or alternatively, against very heavily hardened targets like bunkers deep underground or enemy missile silos. On the regular battlefield, Russia could probably expect to get most of the effect it's after using conventional systems, without the potential complication of then having to ask its troops to advance through radioactive fallout, trusting that a vehicle which might be 40, 50 or 60 years old will provide them adequate protection. If the goal of hypothetical nuclear weapons use then isn't to obtain a serious battlefield advantage, the alternative is intimidation and signalling. The idea that using a nuclear weapon would signal to Kyiv and its various supporters that Moscow was deathly serious about the entire matter, and that the best course of action for them would be to give Russia in that moment exactly what it wants. One of the problems with that potential use case, however, is that it runs face first into the brick wall of the very real phenomenon of the nuclear taboo. This is a reference to the understanding that has grown up amongst most nations over time that using nuclear weapons is something you just shouldn't do. And we have seen how powerful that taboo is on multiple occasions. From the US deciding not to use nuclear weapons even during the hardest moments of the Korean War in the 1950s, all the way through to the present day. The reasons behind that taboo developing are many and varied, but one root driver of it is probably just the logic of self-interest.
Nuclear deterrence can arguably be a stabilising force, reducing the odds of you actually seeing a large-scale conflict between nuclear-armed states. But nuclear use, on the other hand, is likely to be highly destabilising. And so even countries that might claim to be neutral or even supportive of Russia in relation to the war in Ukraine are likely to be very unneutral when it comes to the prospect of Russia actually using nukes. We talked earlier about how India and China, for example, had responded to escalatory Russian language back in the October of 2022. The Indian statement was very diplomatically constructed to address both Ukraine and Russia, but when it came down to the prospect of potential nuclear use, the Indian message can basically be summarised as don't. And it's worth noting that according to later statements by the US Secretary of State, the US appears to believe that it was pushback from China and India that helped push Russia's decision back then to reverse course and dial down the rhetoric. Any Russian usage of nuclear weapons in Ukraine is likely to cause serious international pushback. That might include economic and diplomatic retaliation by countries like India and China, who are absolutely essential to maintaining the integrity of the Russian economy as it currently stands. But it also risks a direct military response, probably a non-nuclear response, by NATO or NATO member states. The assertion here is that maintaining the nuclear taboo is so significant that countries around the world have an incentive to make sure that any country which does use nuclear weapons outside of the most extreme possible scenarios is punished in such a way that they don't receive any net benefit from using those nuclear weapons, thus discouraging other countries from making that same decision. And I find it difficult, at least on paper, to construct a scenario where Russia would get so much military and political benefit out of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine that it would be enough to compensate for the effects of potentially risking direct NATO military action or alienating its main remaining trade partners. Western sanctions can hurt the Russian economy, but Beijing could break it. And the PRC, with a much smaller nuclear arsenal than either the United States or Russia, arguably has some pretty strong incentives to keep nuclear weapons in the do not use column. All of this helps explain why you might find articles like this one in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists arguing that Russia may actually be more likely to use nuclear weapons if it's winning in Ukraine than if it's losing. In that piece, the author argues the following, quote, Russia would still likely incur international political costs from breaking the 8 decades-long taboo on nuclear use, but those costs could be better mitigated by a winning Russia than a losing Russia. The US and NATO allies might not deliver on their threat to impose severe military costs in response to a Russian nuclear strike if Ukraine looks like a lost cause, and opprobrium from China will matter less to a Russia that has won its war in Europe, end quote. The underlying assumption, even in that outlier scenario, though, is that Russia would still face significant consequences, even from erstwhile allies, if it decided to resort to the use of nuclear weapons. And that fact, I'd suggest, might make the calculus of nuclear use even more dubious, almost no matter what Russian doctrine says on the matter. And that leads into a final point, not on the incentives and calculus around nuclear use, but rather around nuclear coercion, and why, even if Russia is able to apply more international pressure by lowering the threshold of use in its own nuclear doctrine, there are also arguably some pretty strong incentives pushing in the other direction, driving Ukraine's various supporters to resist any obvious Russian attempts at nuclear blackmail. This basically comes down to the fact that if you accept that the correct response for any country without nuclear weapons facing a nuclear threat from a nuclear weapon state is just to give them everything they asked for, you're arguably giving nuclear powers around the world a bit of a blank check to go and take whatever they want from their non-nuclear armed neighbours. Applying that logic to the Russia-Ukraine situation, for example, you could argue that if Russia ever made an explicit nuclear threat and the response to that threat was appeasement, there'd probably be a pretty strong incentive for Moscow to take what was on offer and then repeat the whole process. Making nuclear threats is considerably cheaper than launching and winning conventional invasions. And so if there isn't a pushback against explicit or implied nuclear threats, you could see the role of nuclear weapons shift from the last line of deterrence to tools that underwrite all sorts of revisionist ambitions. For those countries around the world that perceive themselves as having an interest in avoiding that kind of scenario, it may actually be harder for them to support making concessions to Moscow in a world where nuclear threats are being made than one where they aren't. The logic here is pretty simple. Russia is incentivized to continue making nuclear threats as long as they keep working. And so the best way to decrease the odds of future nuclear threats being made would be to avoid making any concessions and to respond to attempts at coercion by instead, for example, boosting support for Ukraine. And underneath all of this is probably the understanding that without restraint in the use or threatened use of nuclear weapons, the future of the global non-proliferation system may also be in question. Nuclear powers generally have a pretty strong strategic incentive to protect their own privileged status and stop other countries acquiring nuclear weapons. With a couple of notable exceptions, they've largely achieved that so far through a mixture of carrot and stick incentives. stick in the form of severe economic sanctions and restrictions, like we've seen with Iran, and carrot in the form of things like economic incentives and alliance agreements. But if it ever became clear that the only thing that could protect a country from outright nuclear coercion were nuclear weapons of its own, you might see a stronger incentive for more countries to pursue nuclear weapons, despite the international pushback. For example, some polling suggests that more than 70% of South Koreans would support their country developing a nuclear weapon. The Republic of Korea is a country with an existing civilian nuclear program, a strong basis of engineering and scientific talent, a variety of potential delivery systems from ballistic missiles to aircraft, and probably the human and financial resources necessary to eventually put together a nuclear weapon, provided the country was willing to pay the international cost for doing so. At the moment, a majority of South Korean strategists appear to be against such a move because of faith in things like the nuclear taboo and the American nuclear umbrella. But if the nuclear taboo were ever to weaken, or the United States set a precedent of abandoning friends or allies in the face of nuclear coercion, there's always a chance that the strategic calculus in Seoul would be pushed further towards proliferation, something that likely wouldn't be well received in either Washington or Beijing. Japan is arguably another example, a relatively wealthy country with an existing civilian nuclear program, a strong science, technology and engineering base, significant financial and human resources, and the unfortunate fate of sharing a region with certain nuclear-armed nations like North Korea. Japan's history with nuclear weapons is obviously deeper and more complicated than that of South Korea, but in a strategic sense, their response has been very similar. Rely on the US alliance and nuclear umbrella, and the integrity of the nuclear taboo. However, if circumstances were to ever dramatically change, Japanese strategic thinking might too. As the Japanese Prime Minister put it back in January 2023, Ukraine today may be Asia tomorrow. And were Japan ever to make the incredibly diplomatically costly decision to pursue nuclear weapons, from a technical perspective, there's no reason to believe they couldn't do it. The list of potential countries here goes on, but by this point you probably get the picture. Even countries like Saudi Arabia that don't have the same technical advantages that South Korea or Japan do could potentially become a proliferating country in the far future, because if nothing else, there are a few technical problems that can't be solved if you have billions and billions of dollars to throw at the problem. And the Saudi leadership in the past has even suggested that they would be forced to pursue a nuclear weapon if Iran ever succeeded in obtaining one. At the extreme end, you could even argue Ukraine falls into the category of countries that could probably put together a nuclear weapon if given enough time, incentive and breathing room. Ukrainians played key roles in the Soviet nuclear industrial complex. The country still has a civilian nuclear program. And while the country would have enormous political, economic, diplomatic and technical obstacles to overcome, like sourcing adequate enriched materials or pulling together a delivery system, there are still Ukrainians alive today who worked with Soviet nuclear weapons and nuclear delivery systems. Now, I think the prospect of any Ukrainian nuclear weapon being designed and fielded is incredibly low, if for no other reason than Russia would likely take almost any step necessary in order to prevent one being completed. But the thought experiment serves as a reminder of the fact that, ultimately, nuclear weapons are 1940s technology. And it's ultimately things like the non-proliferation regime, nuclear taboo, international pressure, and constrained access to weapons-grade fissile material that has arguably played a much greater role in constraining the number of countries that have access to these weapons than the technical challenges themselves. And so whenever any of those factors are weakened, the odds of potential future proliferation probably increase. One of the key takeaways of all of this then is probably something like this. Russia's new nuclear doctrine, as expressed by Putin, has probably lowered the threshold for potential future Russian nuclear use. In that narrow respect, all else being equal, we're now probably in a world where Russia is more likely to use nuclear weapons than it was previously. But arguably, a lot of the factors that push nuclear-armed nations like Russia to not use or overly leverage their nuclear weapons have very little to do with their own doctrine and everything to do with international incentives and strategic realities. Russia can probably leverage increased anxiety around potential nuclear use in order to increase pressure on Ukraine or its allies, but in the end, the nuclear taboo is still a thing, and countries still have a very strong incentive to push back against attempts at nuclear coercion. Many of the driving factors in how Russia uses or doesn't use its nuclear weapons in future may ultimately have less to do with any one written document, and more to do with the strategic calculus of whether or not they think using a nuclear weapon in that way will put them in a better position than not doing so. In the past, it appears that warnings and deterrence from allies and competitors alike has been one of the critical factors in restraining Russia from pushing too far with the nuclear brinksmanship. But at the same time, Russia has arguably been repeatedly rewarded for raising nuclear tensions,
with Ukraine's allies choosing to exercise significant self-restraint in supplying critically needed equipment and permissions. That in turn has potentially emboldened Russia to continue leaning on fears over nuclear escalation in order to control the flow of the war in Ukraine and compensate for weaknesses in its conventional position. Only time will tell whether Ukraine's various supporters respond to this apparent change in Russian nuclear doctrine by holding their nerve and continuing to supply critically needed material, or if they self-deter, weaken the Ukrainian position, and potentially incentivize Moscow to further leverage nuclear threats and coercion. And okay, after that cheery topic, let me close out with a quick channel update. Firstly, apologies for any sound quality issues this week. I'm sure my sound guy has done his absolute best, but sometimes there's only so much you can do when you're ad hocing together a sound booth in a hotel room, using chairs, blankets, and the occasional pillow fort. More broadly, I first covered the topic of Russian nuclear doctrine all the way back in early mid-2022. At that point, we hadn't witnessed the kind of language from Moscow that we'd ultimately see a bit later on, and with Russia finally adjusting its nuclear doctrine, I thought now was a good time to revisit the subject, look at some examples of attempted Russian nuclear coercion, the logic of the doctrinal changes, and why, as much as things might sometimes seem to be changing, a lot of the same incentives that have served to protect our world against nuclear use for many decades at this point are still arguably very much in play. That said, it's very much an issue I will always keep my eye on, and if there are further changes in the future, I'll make sure to revisit them. There are some other channel updates I want to give, but given the circumstances, I'll probably hold them off for another week or so. So then, let me close out by just saying thank you to very much all of you for your support as always. Thank you very much to Ground News too for their ongoing support of the channel, and I very much hope to see you all again next week.